The water rose so fast that morning in June 1878 that Julia Anderson barely had time to climb the twisted oak before the Brazos River swallowed her family's abandoned homestead whole. She clung to the highest branches she could reach, her cotton dress plastered to her skin, watching the floodwaters rage beneath her feet with a fury she had never witnessed in all her 22 years. The storm had come without warning during the night, and by dawn, the river had broken its banks and consumed everything in its path. Julia had been collecting eggs from the henhouse when she heard the roar, that terrible sound like 1,000 stampeding cattle, and she ran. Not toward the house, which sat too low in the valley, but toward the old oak on the small rise that jutted above the floodplain. Now she was trapped. The tree stood on what had become a tiny island, no more than 30 feet across, surrounded by churning brown water that stretched in every direction as far as she could see. Her parents had left 2 days earlier for San Antonio to visit her ailing grandmother, and Julia had insisted on staying behind to tend the animals in the garden. The animals were gone now, swept away or drowned, and the garden was buried beneath 6 feet of angry river water. Her arms ached from holding on. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly, and her throat burned with thirst even as water raged all around her. She called for help until her voice went hoarse, but there was no one to hear. The nearest neighbor was the Morrison place, 3 miles downstream, and she had no way of knowing if they had survived or if they too had been consumed by the flood. Julia closed her eyes and prayed. She prayed for rescue, for her parents to somehow know she was in danger, for the water to recede. She prayed until the words blurred together and her lips cracked from the heat. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had moved west, and she realized with growing horror that she had been in the tree for hours. Her fingers were numb, her legs trembling. She did not know how much longer she could hold on. That was when she saw him. At first, she thought she was hallucinating, that the sun and fear had conjured a mirage. But no, there he was, a figure on horseback, moving steadily through the water toward her from the direction of town. The horse was swimming, its powerful legs churning through the current, and the man sat tall in the saddle, guiding the animal with firm hands and strong legs. As they drew closer, Julia could make out details. A broad-shouldered man in a dark hat, his shirt clinging to his chest, his face set with determination. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the rush of water. "I am coming to you!" Julia wanted to respond, but her voice would not work. She could only watch as he navigated the treacherous current, steering the horse around debris and eddies. It seemed to take forever, each second stretching into eternity, but finally he reached the edge of her tiny island. The horse found its footing on the submerged ground and lunged forward, climbing onto the rise with a great surge of muscle and will. The man swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, landing in knee-deep water. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that curled against his neck and eyes the color of storm clouds. Water streamed from his clothes as he waded toward the tree. "Can you climb down?" he asked, looking up at her. His voice was deep, steady despite the chaos around them. "I think so," Julia managed, her voice barely a whisper. Her limbs felt like lead as she began to descend, but the knowledge that rescue was at hand gave her strength. She made it halfway down before her foot slipped on the wet bark. She cried out, falling, but strong arms caught her before she could hit the water. "I have got you," the man said, and Julia found herself pressed against a solid chest, held securely in arms that felt like iron bands. For a moment, she could only breathe, could only feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek and the warmth of his body despite the water that soaked them both. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "We need to move," he said, but his voice was gentle. "The water is still rising. Can you ride?" Julia nodded, though in truth she was not sure she could do anything. Her legs barely supported her when he set her down. The man kept one arm around her waist as he led her to the horse, a magnificent bay stallion that stood calmly despite the circumstances. "This is Duke," the man said. "He is the best swimming horse in 3 counties. He will get us back to town." He mounted first, then reached down for Julia. She grasped his hand and let him pull her up. The world tilted alarmingly, but then she was seated in front of him, cradled against his chest, and his arms came around her to grasp the reins. "Hold on to me," he said, and Julia did not need to be told twice. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his shoulder as Duke turned and plunged back into the water. The journey back was terrifying. The current fought them at every step, trying to sweep them downstream. Debris rushed past, tree limbs and pieces of buildings, and once, horribly, the bloated body of a cow. But the man guided Duke with unwavering confidence, choosing his path carefully, and the horse never faltered. Julia could feel the animal's powerful muscles working beneath them, could feel the man's thighs gripping the saddle, keeping them all steady. She did not know how long it took. Time had lost all meaning, but eventually the water grew shallower, and then Duke's hooves were striking solid ground. They emerged onto the main road leading into Madisonville, water streaming from them like a waterfall. Other people were there, townspeople standing on the high ground, watching the flood with horrified faces. A woman cried out when she saw them and ran forward. "Jacob! Jacob Nelson, you fool! We thought you had drowned too." The man, Jacob, slid from the saddle and reached up to help Julia down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched ground, and he caught her again, lowering her gently to sit on a dry patch of earth. "I am all right, Mrs. Henderson," he said to the woman. "This young lady needed help." Several people crowded around, asking questions, offering blankets and water. Julia drank gratefully from a canteen someone pressed into her hands, the water the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Through it all, Jacob stayed close, answering questions, accepting claps on the back from other men who called him crazy and brave in equal measure. "The Anderson place went under," one man was saying. "Whole valley is flooded. Where were you, miss?" "In the oak tree," Julia said, her voice still hoarse. "On the rise. My parents are in San Antonio. They do not know." "We will get word to them," Mrs. Henderson said kindly. She was a plump woman with a motherly face, and she crouched beside Julia with concern written in every line. "You poor dear, you will stay with us until they return. I would not hear of anything else." Jacob was checking Duke over, running his hands down the horse's legs, speaking softly to the animal. Julia watched him, this stranger who had risked his life to save her. In the sunlight, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features and a jaw dark with stubble. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn denim pants, a simple cotton shirt now torn at the shoulder, a hat that had somehow stayed on his head through everything. There was a quiet competence about him, a steadiness that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with action. He looked up and caught her watching. For a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, something Julia could not name. Then someone else was speaking to her, and the moment broke. The town of Madisonville had been fortunate. Built on higher ground, it had been spared the worst of the flood, though the lower streets were inundated and several buildings damaged. The destruction would have been far worse if not for the quick action of the townspeople, who had worked through the night to move supplies and livestock to safety. Still, the outlying farms and homesteads had not been so lucky. Julia's home was not the only one destroyed. Mrs. Henderson took Julia to her house, a neat clapboard structure on Oak Street. Her husband ran the general store, and they had 2 grown sons and a daughter. The daughter, Mary, was close to Julia's age and immediately took her under her wing, providing dry clothes and helping her wash away the mud and river water. "That Jacob Nelson is the finest rider in the county," Mary said, as she helped Julia into a clean dress. "He works at the Double R Ranch, runs cattle. They say he can gentle any horse, no matter how wild. And handsome too, do not you think?" Julia felt her cheeks warm. "I suppose so. I was too frightened to notice." Mary laughed. "Well, you notice now that you are safe. Half the girls in town have tried to catch his eye, but he is not much for socializing, keeps to himself mostly, though he is always polite. My brother says he is the best hand they have ever had at the ranch." Julia wanted to ask more questions, but Mrs. Henderson called them to supper. The meal was simple but filling, and Julia realized she had not eaten since the previous evening. The Henderson family was kind, asking no difficult questions, simply making her feel welcome. After supper, exhaustion crashed over Julia like another wave. Mrs. Henderson showed her to a small bedroom and left her to rest. Julia lay in the clean bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body was exhausted, but her mind would not stop racing. She kept seeing the water, feeling the terror of clinging to that tree, certain she would die. And she kept seeing Jacob, riding toward her through the flood like something out of a dream. The way he had caught her when she fell, the strength of his arms around her on the ride back, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She touched her own chest, feeling her heart race at the memory. She had been too frightened then to fully register what she was feeling, but now, safe and warm, she could acknowledge it. Gratitude, yes. Relief, certainly. But something else, too. Something that made her skin tingle and her breath catch. She told herself it was simply the aftermath of danger, that anyone would feel this way about their rescuer. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something had happened in those moments when Jacob held her. Some connection had formed, some spark had ignited. And from the way he had looked at her, just for that instant before they were interrupted, she thought perhaps he had felt it too. Julia finally slept and dreamed of storm-gray eyes and strong arms that kept her safe. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's violence had never happened. Julia woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue calico dress that fit reasonably well, and went downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen, humming as she worked. "Good morning, dear. How did you sleep?" "Very well, thank you. You have all been so kind." "Nonsense. It is what neighbors do. Sit down and eat. You need your strength." Julia sat at the table, and Mrs. Henderson placed a plate before her, piled high with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. As she ate, Mr. Henderson came in, a tall, thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Morning, Miss Anderson. Good to see you looking better. I have sent a telegram to San Antonio, to the hotel where your parents are staying. They should receive word today." "Thank you so much," Julia said, relief flooding through her. Her parents would have been frantic with worry. "Also, young Jacob Nelson stopped by the store early this morning, asking after you. I told him you were recovering well. He wanted to make sure you were all right." Julia's heart skipped. "He did?" "Indeed. Nice young man, that Jacob. Quiet, but solid. You could do worse than to thank him properly for what he did." Mrs. Henderson swatted her husband with a dish towel. "Henry, do not embarrass the girl." But Julia was not embarrassed. She wanted to see Jacob again. Wanted to thank him properly, as Mr. Henderson suggested. More than that, she wanted to see if that connection she had felt was real or imagined. "Where might I find him?" she asked. "I would like to thank him." "He is likely at the Double R Ranch," Mr. Henderson said. "About 2 miles west of town. But you should rest today, miss. Plenty of time for that later." Julia agreed, though she felt restless. She spent the morning helping Mrs. Henderson with chores, grateful for the distraction. In the afternoon, Mary took her walking through town so she could see the flood damage. Several streets were still underwater, and people were working to clear mud and debris. Everyone they passed had a story about the flood, about narrow escapes and terrible losses. Julia heard that at least 5 people had died, swept away by the water, and many more had lost their homes and livelihoods. It could have been her. If not for Jacob, it would have been her. The thought made her shiver despite the warm sun. Mary noticed and linked her arm through Julia's. "You are safe now. That is what matters." They were walking past the church when someone called out, "Miss Anderson!" Julia turned to see Jacob striding toward them. He had cleaned up, though his clothes were the same working gear. His dark hair was still damp, as if he had recently washed. In the daylight, Julia could see details she had missed before, the slight crook in his nose, as if it had been broken once, the scar on his chin, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Mr. Nelson," she said, and her voice came out breathless. Mary was squeezing her arm rather hard. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said, stopping a polite distance away. He held his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. "I am glad to see you up and about." "Thanks to you," Julia said. "I owe you my life, Mr. Nelson. I do not know how I can ever repay you." He looked uncomfortable. No repayment needed. Anyone would have done the same. But they did not. You did. You risked your own life. "Duke did most of the work," he said, and there was the hint of a smile on his face. "He is the real hero." Despite everything, Julia laughed. "Then I must thank Duke as well. Is he all right?" "Right as rain. Gave him extra oats and a good rub-down. He's resting at the ranch." An awkward silence fell. Mary, bless her, seemed to sense it and cleared her throat. "I just remembered I promised Mother I would pick up thread at the store. Julia, will you be all right here for a moment?" Before Julia could answer, Mary had released her arm and hurried off, leaving her alone with Jacob. Julia wanted to be annoyed at the obvious matchmaking, but she found she was grateful instead. "Would you like to walk a bit?" Jacob asked, "if you were feeling up to it." "I would like that very much." They walked slowly through town, not saying much at first. Julia was acutely aware of Jacob's presence beside her, of how tall he was, how his long stride adjusted to match her shorter one. People they passed called out greetings, and more than one cast curious glances at them together. Julia knew there would be talk, but she found she did not care. "You are from Madisonville originally?" Jacob asked after a while. "My family moved here 5 years ago from Tennessee," Julia said. "My father wanted to ranch, but it has been difficult. The drought last year nearly ruined us, and now this flood. I do not know what we will do. Your homestead, is it badly damaged?" "I have not been back to see, but it must be. It was completely underwater yesterday." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "When your father returns, I could ride out with him to assess the damage, see what might be salvaged." Julia looked at him in surprise. "You would do that?" He shrugged, but his ears turned slightly red. "I know a bit about building and repairs. It would be no trouble?" "You are very kind. Or very foolish according to most folks." Now he did smile, a quick flash that transformed his face. "Half the town thinks I am crazy for riding out into that flood. And the other half thinks I'm a damned fool." He caught himself. "Pardon my language." Julia smiled. "I think you are brave, and I am grateful you are foolish enough to risk yourself for strangers." "You are not a stranger now," he said quietly, and his eyes met hers. Julia felt that spark again, stronger this time, like lightning jumping between them. They had reached the edge of town without realizing it. The road stretched away toward the open prairie, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and growing things. In the distance, Julia could see cattle grazing on a hillside, small dark shapes against the green. "That is the Double R," Jacob said, pointing. "Where I work. Been there 3 years now." "Do you like it?" "I do. Mr. Ramsey is a fair boss, and I like working with the horses. Always have, since I was a boy." "Where are you from originally?" "Kansas. My family had a farm there, but my parents both died of fever when I was 16. I worked various ranches after that, drifted south eventually." He said it matter-of-factly, but Julia heard the old pain beneath the words. "I am sorry. That must have been very difficult." "It was a long time ago." He turned to her. "What about you? Do you have siblings?" "A younger brother, Thomas. He is 15, working in San Antonio at a printing office. My parents are visiting him, and my grandmother. They will be frantic when they get the telegram. They will be relieved you are safe." "Yes." Julia paused, then said what she had been thinking all day. "If you had not come, Mr. Nelson, I would not be. I would have fallen from that tree eventually, or the water would have risen high enough. You saved my life." Jacob stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I am very glad I got there in time," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "When I heard someone was stranded out there, I did not think. I just knew I had to try, and when I saw you in that tree, so small and frightened, I was more scared than I have ever been. Scared I would not reach you, scared Duke would not make it, scared I would watch you fall." Julia's breath caught. "But you did reach me." "Yes." He lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. His palm was calloused and warm, and Julia leaned into the touch without thinking. "I reached you." They stood there in the morning sun, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Julia saw her own feelings reflected in Jacob's eyes, wonder, uncertainty, and something deeper, something that had taken root the moment he caught her falling from that tree. "Julia," he said, testing her name, and she loved the way it sounded in his voice. "Yes, Jacob?" "I know this is sudden, and I do not want to presume anything, but would you allow me to call on you properly? I would very much like to know you better." Joy bloomed in Julia's chest like a flower opening to the sun. "I would like that too, very much." Jacob's smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something almost boyish. He dropped his hand from her cheek, but slowly, as if reluctant to break contact. "Your father, when he returns, I will speak to him. Explain my intentions. My father is a practical man. He will appreciate that you saved his daughter's life. I hope he will judge me on more than that one action. I have steady work, money saved, good prospects. I would want him to know I could provide well." The implication made Julia's heart race. They had known each other for less than a day, but she understood what he was saying. This was not a casual courtship he proposed. This was something serious, something with a future in mind. Let us take it one step at a time, she said softly. But yes, I would be very happy if you called on me. They walked back to town together, talking more easily now. Jacob told her about his work at the ranch, about the horses he trained, and the cattle drives he had been on. Julia told him about her life before Texas, about Tennessee and the mountains she had loved. They discovered shared interests. Both loved writing, both enjoyed reading, though books were scarce. Both valued honesty and hard work above all else. By the time they reached the Henderson house, Julia felt as if she had known Jacob for years rather than hours. It was the strangest thing, this instant connection. But it felt right in a way she could not explain. Mary was waiting on the porch, trying and failing to look innocent. Jacob tipped his hat to both of them. I should get back to work. Miss Anderson, Miss Henderson, good day. Good day, Mr. Nelson, Julia said, watching as he walked away with that loose, easy stride. She could feel Mary practically vibrating with curiosity beside her. The moment Jacob was out of earshot, Mary grabbed her arm. Tell me everything. Where did you walk? What did you talk about? Is he going to court you? Julia laughed. So many questions. Yes, he asked if he could call on me properly. And we just talked, Mary, about our lives, our families. I knew it, Mary crowed. I knew when I saw how he looked at you yesterday. Everyone noticed it, Julia. The way he held you when he brought you in, like you were made of glass and might break. Had he? Julia had been so dazed she barely remembered arriving in town. But she remembered how it felt to be in his arms, remembered the solid strength of him, the way he had made her feel utterly safe despite the raging water all around. It is too soon to know anything, Julia said, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not true. Something had begun between her and Jacob, something that felt inevitable and right. The flood had taken so much from her and from others, but it had also brought her to this man, this moment, and Julia could not bring herself to regret it. Her parents arrived 2 days later, having ridden hard from San Antonio the moment they received the telegram. Her mother, Sarah, wept when she saw Julia safe, clutching her daughter to her chest and thanking God over and over. Her father, Robert, was more stoic, but Julia saw the relief and love in his eyes when he embraced her. We should never have left you alone, her mother said. If something had happened to you, I could never have forgiven myself. Nothing did happen, Mother. I am fine, and the animals would have died anyway, even if I had left with you. It was not your fault. No one expected this. They stayed with the Hendersons, all of them crowded into the house, while Robert rode out to survey the damage to their homestead. He came back grim-faced. The house still stood, but everything inside was destroyed, the furniture ruined, the walls thick with mud. The barn had collapsed, the garden was gone. It would take months of work and more money than they had to restore it. We might have to sell, he told Sarah that evening, not realizing Julia was listening from the next room. Start over somewhere else, or try to find work in town. Julia's heart sank. This was her home, the only real home she had known since leaving Tennessee. But more than that, if they left Madisonville, she would have to leave Jacob. And the thought of that, after just a few days, was unbearable. She had seen him twice more since that first walk. He had come to call at the Henderson house, hat in hand, painfully proper in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. They had talked, chaperoned by Mary or Mrs. Henderson, and Jacob had been everything respectful and courteous. But Julia had seen the heat in his eyes when he looked at her, felt the electricity when their hands accidentally touched. Now, determined, she went to her father. Papa, I want to talk to you about the homestead. Robert looked tired, older than his 45 years. Not now, Julia. I am trying to figure out what to do. I know. That is why I want to talk. There might be another option. Her father sighed but gestured for her to sit. Julia took a breath and told him about Jacob's offer to help assess the damage and make repairs. Jacob Nelson? Her father asked. The cowboy who rescued you? Yes, he is very skilled with building and repairs. He offered to help, and he would not take any payment. I cannot accept charity, Julia. It is not charity, Papa. He wants to help. Her father studied her, and Julia saw understanding dawn in his eyes. I see. And how well do you know this young man? Julia lifted her chin. Well enough to know he is good and honest and hardworking. Well enough to want to know him better. Julia, you have known him less than a week. I know, but sometimes you just know, Papa. Is that not what you have always told me? That you knew Mother was the one for you the first time you saw her? Robert could not argue with that, and his expression softened. That is true, but your mother and I courted for a proper time before we married. I want the same for you, if this young man is serious. He is serious. He wants to speak with you, properly, about his intentions. Does he now? Her father was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right, send word that I would like to meet with him tomorrow, and he can ride out to the homestead with me after, if he truly wants to help. I will not turn down honest assistance, charity or not. Julia could have kissed him. Instead, she hugged him tight. Thank you, Papa. The next day, Jacob arrived early, dressed in his best clothes, clean trousers, a pressed shirt, boots polished to a shine. Julia watched from the window as he spoke with her father, on the porch, their conversation too low to hear. She tried not to fidget, tried not to imagine all the ways it could go wrong, but after half an hour, both men came inside, and her father was smiling. Julia, Mr. Nelson has asked permission to court you formally. I have given my consent, provided the courtship is conducted properly and with respect. Julia beamed. Thank you, Papa. Jacob met her eyes across the room, and the smile he gave her was private, meant only for her. Thank you, sir. I will do right by your daughter. You have my word. See that you do. Now, shall we ride out and look at this damage? The two men left together, and Julia was left with her mother, who had been listening from the kitchen. Sarah came out and put her arm around her daughter. He seems like a fine young man, she said, and anyone can see he is smitten with you. But Julia, are you certain? You have been through an ordeal. Sometimes strong emotions in crisis can feel like more than they are. It is not that, Mother, Julia said. I feel it too, this connection. It is like we were meant to find each other. Sarah smiled. Then I am happy for you. Just promise me you will take your time. Get to know him truly. Marriage is wonderful, but it is also hard work. You need to be sure. I promise. Over the following weeks, Julia kept that promise. She and Jacob spent as much time together as propriety and work allowed. He came to dinner at the Henderson house, where her family was still staying. They walked together through town, always chaperoned. On Sundays after church, they would sit together on the church lawn, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Julia learned that Jacob loved to read, especially books about far-off places he had never been. That he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh. That he was patient and kind, but also stubborn when he believed he was right. That he had a beautiful singing voice, though he was shy about using it. That he dreamed of having his own ranch someday, his own land and horses. Jacob learned that Julia was more educated than most women in the area, having been taught by a governess in Tennessee. That she had a quick temper when roused but forgave easily. That she loved thunderstorms and hated snakes. That she could ride as well as any man, but was hopeless at cooking. That she wanted children someday, a house full of them. And through it all, the attraction between them only grew stronger. Julia found herself thinking about Jacob constantly, about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, about his strong hands and broad shoulders, about the way her heart raced when he was near. She dreamed about him at night, dreams that made her wake flushed and breathless. She could see the same desire in Jacob, the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, his gaze intense and hungry, the way his hands would linger when he helped her mount a horse or step over a puddle, the way his voice would roughen when they were alone, even for just a moment. But they were proper. They followed the rules of courtship, knowing that anything less would reflect badly on both families. And so, they waited, building something solid and true beneath the surface attraction. Meanwhile, Jacob and Robert worked on the homestead. True to his word, Jacob came every day after finishing his work at the ranch. Other men from town came too, neighbors helping neighbors, as was the way in these parts. Slowly the house was cleaned out, the walls repaired, the roof patched. A new barn went up, smaller than the old one, but sturdy. Robert planted a new garden, and Sarah began making the house a home again. One evening in late July, nearly 2 months after the flood, Jacob asked Julia to walk with him after dinner. They strolled toward the edge of town, Mary following at a discreet distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was finally cooling after the heat of the day. Your family will be able to move back to the homestead soon, Jacob said. Yes, thanks in large part to you. I do not think we could have done it without your help. You would have managed. Your father is a determined man. Jacob paused, then said, Julia, there is something I want to talk to you about. Julia's heart began to race. All right. We have been courting for 2 months now. I know that is not very long by most standards, but it feels like I have known you forever. Like I was waiting for you all my life and did not even know it. He stopped walking and turned to face her. In the fading light, his eyes were dark and earnest. I love you, Julia. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you in that tree. So scared but so brave. And every day since then, I have loved you more. Tears pricked Julia's eyes. Jacob, I love you too. So much it frightens me sometimes. He took her hands in his, holding them gently. Then marry me. I know I do not have much to offer yet. I am just a cowboy with some money saved. But I am a hard worker, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy, making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret it, Julia whispered. Yes, Jacob. Yes, I will marry you. Jacob's face blazed with joy. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Julia held him just as tightly. She could feel his heart pounding against hers, could feel the tremor in his hands. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his own cheeks. I will talk to your father tonight, ask for your hand properly, and I will buy you a ring, a proper ring. It might take me a few weeks to save up for a nice one, but I want you to have something beautiful. I do not need a fancy ring, Julia said. I just need you. But she could see that this was important to him, this symbol of his ability to provide, and so she did not argue further. They walked back to the house, holding hands, both of them grinning like fools. Mary, who had seen everything, was practically bouncing with excitement. That evening, Jacob spoke to Robert again. Julia waited in her room, too nervous to eavesdrop, until her father called her down. Robert's expression was serious, and for a moment, Julia's heart stopped, but then he smiled. Mr. Nelson has asked for your hand in marriage, and I have given my blessing. He is a good man, Julia. I believe he will make you happy. Julia flew into her father's arms. Thank you, Papa. Thank you. Your mother and I would like you to wait until spring to marry, to give you time to prepare properly, and to make sure this is truly what you both want. Spring was 9 months away. Julia wanted to protest, wanted to say they could be married tomorrow and she would be happy, but she understood her father's caution. All right, spring. And the engagement will be announced properly in the church and in the newspaper. We will do this right. Julia agreed to everything. What did it matter? The formalities and the waiting, when she knew how the story ended. She was going to marry Jacob Nelson, and they were going to be happy. She was certain of it with every fiber of her being. The engagement was announced the following Sunday. The news spread through Madisonville like wildfire, and Julia found herself the subject of much gossip and speculation. Most of it was friendly, people happy for the young couple. But there were a few sour notes too, girls who had set their caps at Jacob and were bitter about his choice. Older women who sniffed that the courtship had been too short and too public. Julia ignored them. She had Jacob, and that was all that mattered. He bought her a ring 3 weeks later, a simple gold band with a small but perfect sapphire. He slipped it on her finger at a church picnic, in front of everyone, and kissed her hand. It was the most public display of affection they had shared, and Julia's cheeks burned with pleasure and embarrassment. It is beautiful, she told him. Perfect. Like you, he said, and Julia laughed at his earnestness, even as her heart swelled with love. The months passed slowly. Julia and her family moved back to the homestead in August, and Julia threw herself into making it a home again. She also began preparing for the wedding, sewing her dress, planning the ceremony, learning to cook with her mother's patient instruction. Jacob came to call every Sunday without fail, and they stole what moments they could together. The waiting was agony. Julia wanted to be Jacob's wife, wanted to start their life together, but she understood her parents' wisdom. The time allowed them to make practical plans, to save money, to prepare for their future. Jacob worked extra hours at the ranch, building up his savings. He also began looking for land, a place where they could eventually start their own ranch. In November, he found it. 80 acres 10 miles south of Madisonville, with good grass and a creek running through it. The price was fair, and with his savings and a small loan from the bank, he was able to buy it. It is ours, he told Julia, his voice filled with wonder. Our land. I am going to build us a house there, a real house. It will take me all winter, but it will be ready by spring when we marry. Julia cried when she saw the property. It was beautiful, rolling grassland with stands of oak trees and that lovely creek sparkling in the sunlight. She could picture their house there, their children playing, horses grazing. She could see their whole future spread before them. "It is perfect," she told Jacob. "Absolutely perfect." He kissed her then, a real kiss, not just a peck on the cheek. It was brief because they were standing in the open where anyone might see, but it was enough to make Julia's head spin and her body ache with wanting. When he pulled away, they were both breathing hard. "Spring cannot come fast enough," Jacob said roughly, and Julia could only nod in agreement. Winter seemed to drag on forever. Jacob worked on their house every spare moment, often by lantern light after dark. Robert and some of the other men from town helped when they could. Slowly, the structure took shape. 2 rooms for now, with plans to add more later. A solid roof, good windows, a fireplace for heat and cooking. Jacob built the furniture himself, a bed frame and a table and chairs, all simple but sturdy. Julia visited the property as often as she could, watching the progress with growing excitement. She and her mother sewed curtains, blankets, quilts. She collected dishes and pots and pans. Her small hope chest began to fill with the things she would need to set up housekeeping. She also learned more about running a household. Her mother taught her not just cooking, but also preserving food, making soap, tending sick animals, all the skills she would need as a ranch wife. It was hard work, harder than Julia had realized, but she was determined to be a good wife to Jacob, to be a true partner in their life together. Christmas came and went. Jacob gave her a beautiful shawl he had bought from a traveling merchant, deep blue wool to match her ring. Julia gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, every stitch made with love. They spent Christmas Day with both their families, and Julia felt the rightness of it, how well Jacob fit with her parents, how easily he belonged. In January, the house was finished. Jacob took Julia to see it, and she walked through the rooms with tears streaming down her face. It was not large or fancy, but it was theirs. Every board and nail had been placed with care and love. Jacob had even carved their initials into the lintel above the door, JN plus JA. "It is perfect," Julia said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Jacob, it is absolutely perfect." He held her close, and Julia could feel the satisfaction radiating from him. He had built this with his own hands, a home for his wife and future family. It was tangible proof of his love and his commitment, and Julia had never loved him more than she did in that moment. February brought the first signs of spring, warmer days, wildflowers starting to bloom, birds returning from their winter homes. The wedding was set for the first Sunday in April, and final preparations consumed Julia's life. There were fittings for her dress, meetings with the preacher, plans for the reception. The whole town seemed caught up in the excitement, everyone eager to celebrate the couple who had found love in the midst of disaster. The night before the wedding, Julia could not sleep. She lay in her bed at the homestead, listening to the sounds of night and thinking about everything that was about to change. By this time tomorrow, she would be Julia Nelson, Jacob's wife. They would ride out to their new home together, and she would begin her life as a married woman. It was exciting and terrifying in equal measure. Julia was not innocent. She knew what happened between a husband and wife, had heard enough whispers from married women to understand the basics. But knowing about something and experiencing it were very different things. She was nervous about the wedding night, about whether she would please Jacob, about whether it would hurt as much as some women claimed. But more than the nervousness, she felt excitement. She loved Jacob with everything in her. She trusted him completely, and she wanted to be his in every way, wanted to share everything with him. The physical intimacy was just another expression of the emotional bond they had already forged. Finally, as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Julia slept, and she dreamed of Jacob, of strong arms and gentle hands, of whispered words of love. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the sky a perfect blue, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Julia dressed in the gown she and her mother had made, a simple white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her mother helped her with her hair, pinning it up and threading blue ribbons through it. When Julia looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked older, more womanly, radiant with happiness. "You are beautiful," her mother said, tears in her eyes. "Your father and I are so proud of you, Julia, and so happy that you found such a good man. I love him so much, Mama. I know, darling, and he loves you just as much. Anyone can see it. You are very blessed." The ceremony was held in the small church, packed with well-wishers. Julia walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes locked on Jacob waiting at the altar. He looked impossibly handsome in his best suit, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes shining with love as he watched her approach. When she reached him, he took her hand, and Julia felt the rightness of it settle deep in her bones. This was where she was meant to be, beside this man, for the rest of her life. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage. Julia barely heard the words. She was too focused on Jacob, on the feel of his hand in hers, on the way he was looking at her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. They spoke their vows clearly, their voices steady despite the emotion. Jacob slipped a second ring onto her finger, a simple wedding band to nestle beside the sapphire engagement ring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and passion that made Julia's toes curl in her shoes. The congregation applauded and cheered. Julia and Jacob walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, grinning like children. Outside, people threw rice and flowers, and someone had decorated a wagon with ribbons and tin cans for the newlyweds to ride in. The reception was held at the Henderson House, the largest home in town. There was music and dancing, food and drink, toasts and speeches. Julia danced with her father, with Jacob, with what felt like every man in town. Jacob was less enthusiastic about dancing, but gamely partnered with her mother and Mary and the other women. As the afternoon wore on, Julia felt anticipation building. Soon they would leave, would ride out to their new home to begin their marriage in truth. She saw the same anticipation in Jacob's eyes every time their gazes met across the room. Finally, as the sun began to set, they made their escape. Amid more cheers and well-wishes, they climbed into the decorated wagon. Jacob took the reins, and they rode out of town toward their land, toward their future. The ride took less than an hour, but it felt both endless and far too short. They did not talk much, just held hands and stole glances at each other. The tension between them was thick enough to cut. Anticipation and desire and a little nervousness all mixed together. When they arrived at the house, full dark had fallen. Jacob had been out earlier to light lamps, and the windows glowed warmly in the darkness. He helped Julia down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" Julia laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It is tradition." He carried her through the door and set her down gently in the middle of their home. For a moment, they just stood there, looking around. Someone, probably Julia's mother and Mary, had been here recently. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the table. The bed was made up with Julia's quilts, and a fire was laid in the fireplace waiting to be lit. "Do you want me to light the fire?" Jacob asked. "It is cooling down outside." "Yes, please." While Jacob saw to the fire, Julia wandered through the two rooms, touching things, making them real. Here was the table Jacob had built, solid and smooth. Here were the chairs, the curtains she had sewn, now hanging at the windows. Here was the bed where she would sleep beside her husband every night for the rest of her life. The thought made her shiver with anticipation. Jacob finished with the fire and straightened, dusting off his hands. When he turned, he found Julia watching him from beside the bed. Their eyes met, and everything else fell away. Jacob crossed the room slowly, giving her time to object or retreat. But Julia did not move. She stood there waiting, her heart hammering in her chest, as he came to stand before her. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "A little," Julia admitted, "but more excited than nervous." "I have never done this before," Jacob said, and Julia heard the vulnerability in his voice. "I want it to be good for you. I want everything to be perfect." Julia reached up and touched his cheek. "It will be perfect because it is us. I love you, Jacob. I trust you completely." He kissed her then, deeply, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. Julia kissed him back, just as passionately, her arms going around his neck, her body pressing against his. She felt his hands on her waist, sliding up her back, and she shivered with pleasure. "Julia," he breathed against her lips. "My wife." "My husband," she whispered back, and the words felt sacred, binding. They undressed each other slowly, learning each other's bodies, taking time despite the urgency building between them. Jacob was patient and gentle, making sure Julia was comfortable, checking in with her constantly. There were awkward moments, fumbling moments, moments when they both laughed nervously. But there were also moments of pure connection, of overwhelming sensation, of love so intense it was almost painful. When they finally came together, Julia gasped at the feeling of completion, of rightness. There was discomfort, yes, but Jacob was careful, and it faded quickly into something else, something wonderful. They moved together instinctively, finding their rhythm, and when release came, it was for both of them, waves of pleasure crashing over them simultaneously. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, Julia's head on Jacob's chest, his arms wrapped around her. The fire crackled softly. Outside, nightbirds called to each other. "I love you," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "So much, Julia, more than I ever thought I could love anyone." "I love you too," Julia whispered, feeling tears prick her eyes. "Thank you." "For what?" "For saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me." "You saved me too," Jacob said. "I did not even know I was drowning until you pulled me to shore." Julia smiled at that, at the poetry of it. They had saved each other in all the ways that mattered, and now they had the rest of their lives to continue saving each other over and over again. They eventually fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, and Julia had never felt more content, more complete. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, but a happy one. Julia learned the rhythms of running a household, of caring for the garden and the chickens they bought, and the horse Jacob gave her as a wedding present. She learned to cook, not just edible meals, but actually good ones, though it took many burned dinners and patient coaching from Jacob before she got the hang of it. Jacob continued working at the Double R Ranch, but also began building up their own herd. He bought a few head of cattle, then a few more. He bred horses, starting with Duke and a mare he bought. Slowly, their ranch began to take shape. They worked hard, but they also made time for each other. Sunday afternoons were sacred, time when they would ride together or simply sit on the porch and talk. In the evenings, they would read aloud to each other, or Jacob would play the harmonica he had taught himself, or they would simply hold each other and watch the sunset. And the nights were magical. They learned each other's bodies thoroughly, discovered what brought pleasure, grew comfortable and playful and passionate. Julia had never imagined she could feel this way, so desired and desiring, so complete. In October, 8 months after their wedding, Julia realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was just the hard work and the heat, but when she missed a second month and began feeling nauseous in the mornings, she knew. She was pregnant. Julia was both terrified and elated. She waited until she was certain before telling Jacob, and when she finally did, his reaction made all her fears evaporate. He let out a whoop of joy, picked her up, and spun her around despite her protests, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Julia asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy? Julia, I am more than happy. I am blessed. We are blessed." He knelt down and pressed his face against her still flat belly. "Hello in there, little one. I am your papa, and I already love you so much." Julia ran her fingers through his hair, her own eyes wet with tears. They were going to be parents. They were going to bring a new life into this world, a child made of their love. It was overwhelming and perfect. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Julia was tired and sick for the first few months. Jacob was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying that she was working too hard or not eating enough. Julia found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. As her belly grew, Jacob would talk to the baby every night, telling stories, singing softly. He built a cradle, beautiful and sturdy, carved with horses and flowers. Julia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing a space in their bedroom for the baby. Her parents visited often, excited about becoming grandparents. Jacob's ranch was doing well, and they had saved enough money that Julia did not need to work so hard during the pregnancy. She could rest when she needed to, could focus on preparing for the baby. In late May, 13 months after their wedding, Julia went into labor. It was long and difficult, the pain worse than anything she had imagined. Jacob stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement. The midwife, an older woman named Mrs. Potts, was calm and capable. After nearly 20 hours, just as dawn was breaking, Julia gave birth to a son. He came into the world squalling, red-faced and perfect. Mrs. Potts cleaned him up and placed him in Julia's arms, and Julia fell in love all over again. "He is beautiful," she whispered, tracing her finger over the baby's tiny face. "Jacob, look at him. He is perfect." Jacob was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son. "He is a miracle. You are a miracle. Julia, you are so strong. I am in awe of you." They named him James Robert Nelson, after both his grandfathers. Jamie, they called him. And from the moment he entered the world, he owned both his parents' hearts completely. Parenthood was exhausting and wonderful. Jamie was a good baby, but he still woke frequently to nurse, and Julia was perpetually tired. Jacob helped as much as he could, walking with Jamie when he was fussy, changing him, singing to him. Julia would often wake in the night to find Jacob standing by the cradle, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. As Jamie grew, his personality emerged. He was curious and bold, always exploring, always getting into things. He had Julia's green eyes and Jacob's dark hair. His laugh was infectious, and both Julia and Jacob would do anything to hear it. When Jamie was 18 months old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she knew the signs immediately. Jacob was just as excited as the first time, though he was more cautious too, remembering how difficult Jamie's birth had been. This pregnancy was easier, maybe because Julia knew what to expect, or maybe because her body had already done this once. Their daughter was born on a cold January morning, coming faster than Jamie had. A quick, intense labor that left Julia exhausted, but relieved. They named her Emily Sarah Nelson, after Jacob's mother and Julia's. Emmy, they called her. And she was her brother's opposite, calm and observant, content to watch the world rather than charge into it. Now their house felt truly full. 2 children, a thriving ranch, a marriage that grew stronger and deeper every year. Julia and Jacob expanded the house, adding 2 more rooms so the children could have their own space as they grew. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters, sick animals and crop failures. Money was sometimes tight. The children got sick, injuries happened, arguments occurred. But through it all, Julia and Jacob faced everything together, their partnership the foundation on which everything else was built. On their 5th anniversary, Jacob surprised Julia with a trip to San Antonio, just the 2 of them. Her parents watched the children, and Julia and Jacob spent 3 days in the city, acting like newlyweds again. They stayed in a hotel, ate at restaurants, went to a theater performance. And they remembered what it was like to just be Jacob and Julia, husband and wife, not just mama and papa. "Thank you for this," Julia said on their last night, lying in Jacob's arms in the hotel bed. "I needed it more than I realized." "I did too. I love our children more than anything, but I love you too. I never want us to forget that, to lose sight of what we have together." "We will never lose it," Julia said confidently. "We are too stubborn to let that happen." Jacob laughed, that deep, warm sound Julia loved. "True. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. And you love me for it." "I do. I love everything about you, Julia Nelson." They made love slowly, taking their time, relearning each other after months of quick stolen moments between childcare and ranch work. It was sweet and intense, and afterward, Julia felt renewed, reconnected to this man she had chosen to spend her life with. The children grew. Jamie became tall and strong, following his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. Emmy was quieter, but no less capable, and she had a gift with horses that even Jacob marveled at. When she was only 5, she gentled a wild colt that had been considered untrainable. When Jamie was 8 and Emmy 6, Julia became pregnant a 3rd time. It was unexpected as she and Jacob had assumed they were done having children, but Julia found she was happy about it. She had loved having babies in the house, and Emmy was growing up so fast. This pregnancy was the hardest yet, perhaps because Julia was older now, 32 instead of 23. She was exhausted and sick for months. But Jacob was there, and so were Jamie and Emmy, both of them eager to help prepare for the new baby. Their 2nd son was born in early spring, during a thunderstorm that shook the house. Julia labored through the night, while lightning flashed and thunder rolled. And when the baby finally came with the dawn, the storm broke and the sun came out. They named him Thomas Jacob Nelson, after Julia's brother and his father. Tommy, they called him. And he was the happiest baby Julia had ever seen. Always smiling, always content. With 3 children, the house was loud and chaotic and full of love. Julia sometimes felt overwhelmed, pulled in a dozen directions at once. But Jacob was always there, steady and strong, helping with the children, taking on extra work so Julia could rest. They were partners in every sense of the word, and Julia could not imagine facing life with anyone else. Jamie grew into a young man, serious and hard-working like his father. At 18, he began courting a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Catherine. Emmy, at 16, was already turning heads, though she seemed oblivious to the attention. She only had eyes for horses, spending every spare moment in the barn or the pastures. Tommy, at 10, was still the family clown, always laughing, always finding joy in everything. He kept them all young, kept them all smiling even when times were hard. On their 20th anniversary, Julia and Jacob sat on their porch watching the sunset, much as they had on countless evenings before. Tommy was with Julia's parents in town. Emmy was in the barn with her horses. Jamie was at the neighbors, probably stealing kisses from Catherine. 20 years, Julia said, leaning against Jacob's shoulder. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like forever. But always, always, it feels right. He kissed the top of her head. You have made me the happiest man alive, Julia Nelson. And you saved me, Jacob. Not just that day in the flood, but every day since. You saved me from a life alone, from never knowing what real love feels like. We saved each other, Jacob said, just as he had on their wedding night all those years ago. And we will keep saving each other for the rest of our lives. Julia thought back to that terrified girl clinging to a tree in the raging flood, certain she was going to die. She thought about the man who had ridden through the water to rescue her, the connection that had sparked between them in that moment of crisis. Everything that had happened since, their courtship and marriage, their children and their life together, it had all started with that one moment of fate. I would do it all again, Julia said. Every moment, every hardship, every joy. If it meant ending up here with you, I would do it all the same. So would I, Jacob said, though maybe without the flood next time. Julia laughed, and Jacob joined her, and they sat there together as the sun set over their land, over the life they had built together. The years continued to pass. Jamie married Catherine and gave them 2 grandchildren, a boy and a girl. They built a house on the north section of Julia and Jacob's land, expanding the family ranch. Jamie was a good rancher, and he and Jacob worked well together. Emmy, to everyone's surprise, including her own, married a traveling horse trader named Daniel when she was 21. He shared her passion for horses, and together they traveled for several years before settling down on their own small ranch near Austin. They had 4 children, all girls, all of whom inherited their mother's gift with animals. Tommy went to college in Houston, studying law. He became a lawyer, working to help ranchers and farmers with land disputes and water rights. He married late, at 32, to a teacher named Rachel. They settled in Dallas and had 3 children. Julia and Jacob grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of years of hard work. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, the kind of love that only comes from weathering decades of life together. They sold most of the ranch to Jamie and Catherine, keeping only the original house and a few acres around it. They spent their time with their grandchildren, teaching them to ride, telling them stories, spoiling them the way grandparents are supposed to. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the old house. Children, spouses, grandchildren. There were more than 20 people crowded around the tables Jacob and Jamie had set up outside. The noise was incredible, laughter and conversation and children playing. Julia looked around at all of them, at this family she and Jacob had created, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. She caught Jacob's eye across the crowd, and he smiled at her, that special smile that was just for her. After 40 years, he could still make her heart skip a beat. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Julia and Jacob lay in bed together. Jacob's arms were around her, her head on his chest, just as they had lain on their wedding night so many years ago. "Do you remember the flood?" Julia asked. "The day you saved me?" "Every detail," Jacob said. "I remember seeing you in that tree, remember being so afraid I would not reach you in time. I remember how you felt in my arms, how I never wanted to let go." "Best day of my life," Julia said, "even though I almost died." Mine too, because it brought me to you. Do you think we would have found each other if there had not been a flood? If I had not needed saving?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering. "Yes," he finally said. "I think we would have found each other no matter what. Some things are just meant to be." Julia smiled against his chest. "I think so too." They were quiet then, content in each other's arms. Julia listened to Jacob's heartbeat, steady and strong, and thought about how lucky she was to have been saved from the flood, to have found this man, to have built this life, to have loved and been loved so completely. "Jacob," she said softly. "Yes, my love. Thank you for riding out into that water. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for holding on until I got there," Jacob said. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked to court you, for marrying me, for giving me this beautiful life. Thank you for 40 years of happiness." "Here is to 40 more," Julia said, though they both knew that was unlikely at their age. "However long we have," Jacob said, "I will love you every day of it. And I will love you." They fell asleep like that together, as they had every night for 40 years. And if Julia dreamed of a young cowboy riding through floodwaters to save a frightened girl, and if those dreams made her smile, well, that was her secret to keep. Jacob died on a warm September evening 5 years later, quietly in his sleep with Julia holding his hand. He was 74 years old, and he had lived a good life, a life full of love and purpose and family. Julia mourned him deeply, but she did not regret. They had had 45 beautiful years together, and that was more than many people ever got. She lived another 3 years after Jacob, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She stayed in their house, the one Jacob had built with his own hands, and she spent her days remembering and being grateful. She died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, 78 years old. Her family found her with a smile on her face, and in her hand was a faded photograph of a young cowboy on a bay horse, taken not long after their marriage. They buried her next to Jacob on a hill overlooking their land, where they could watch over the ranch and the family they had built together. And if the people at the funeral talked about the great love story of Julia and Jacob Nelson, about the cowboy who swam his horse through a flood to save the woman he would marry, well, it was a story worth telling. Because love like that, love that starts in crisis and grows through decades of partnership and commitment, love that creates families and legacies and memories, that kind of love is rare and precious. And it all started with a flood, a frightened woman in a tree, and a brave man who decided that some things are worth risking everything for. The story of Julia and Jacob became legend in Madisonville, passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing about the Great Flood of 1878, about the cowboy and his swimming horse, about the rescue that led to the greatest love story the town had ever known. And years later, more than a century later, people still told the story, still remembered, because love like that does not die. It lives on in the children and grandchildren, in the land that was worked and loved, in the house that still stands, in the memories that are treasured and retold. Julia and Jacob's love story became part of the fabric of the town, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, that courage and love can overcome any obstacle, that the choices we make in crisis define the rest of our lives. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond, Julia and Jacob are together still, young again, riding through endless fields under wide Texas skies. Their love, as strong and true as it was on that first day when he pulled her from the tree and she fell into his arms, and they both knew, even then, that they had found something rare and precious and worth holding on to for the rest of their lives.